Yes. Good afternoon, dear guests. I'm so happy that you are all here and welcome to the MURCIR Wednesday Talks. Yes, its name is Wednesday, but no matter at the end, it's a tradition for us to keep the name as it is since the beginning of these seminars. I'm Zuhal Mertuzuner, Director of Marmara University Research Center for International Relations, shortly MURCIR. I have been here since last December as director. Before we delve into our session, let me provide a brief introduction about our research center. MURCIR has been a pillar of academic excellence for the past 30 years. Thanks to invaluable contributions of numerous prominent scholars in Turkish academia, it has not only witnessed but also actively contributed to the evolution of international relations discipline since the end of the Cold War. We encourage you to follow our activities through social media accounts and our YouTube channel. Our research center aims to contribute academic researches, intersecting fields, sometimes the political science, international relations, and sociology. There are other social sciences also in the field of interest in Turkey. And we are trying to follow the global developments in our programs. We organize conferences, panels, workshops, and some semi-academic studies like the commentaries, MURCIR analysis, and MURCIR papers. And today we have a very prominent guest speaker, Samuel Dovery Vesterbye. He is Managing Director in European Neighborhood Council. His expertise is on Turkey, Iraq, and Jordan, and he has an MA in Middle Eastern and Central Asian Security Studies from the University of St. Andrews. We plan to discuss the EU-Turkey relations. I'm sure all you are following very difficult path we have now in our relations. And Turkey as a candidate had so unfortunate, let's say, the developments in the last decade. There are many reasons for that, of course, but the question may be where are we today? So what are the problems and opportunities in front of us? Let's listen first our speaker and a guest speaker, and then we may discuss with several questions. Yes, dear Mr. Vesterbye, thank you for accepting our invitation, and welcome to MURCIR Talks again. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Zuhal. First and foremost, thank you so much for inviting me today. We at the European Neighborhood Council, which is the organization that I work for, have a long tradition of working with Turkey. We have a lot of colleagues in Turkey, and we deeply believe that the relationship between the EU and Turkey is of utmost importance. And also, we have a long tradition of working with universities in the country, as well as students and also with the academics. The topic of EU-Turkey relations, it's one of those strange things. It evokes a lot of emotions amongst many people all across the EU and across Turkey as well. I mean, if you go into any classroom, even in France or in Sweden or in Ankara or in Istanbul or in Izmir or wherever in Eskişehir, you will get a strong reaction. And I think the reason is simple. It's that the relationship is extremely relevant. It's undeniable. The relation between the EU and Turkey is not the relationship between Indonesia and the EU. It's not the relationship between Turkey and Argentina. I mean, these are important countries and we care about them, and they're important for economic reasons and some critical raw materials or lithium or this and that. But the relationship between the EU and Turkey is far, far deeper, and it's far more historical. When the Ottoman Empire was collapsing, over 200 years ago, nearly now, or 150 years ago, and the denomination of the Ottoman Empire as the sick man of Europe, the name Europe was there. So it was regarded already as the leadership in historical terms as a crucial part of Europe. And I think this evokes a lot of emotions and sentiments among people even today, even beyond the practical policy making and the everyday issues that we're dealing with. And then we have to remember that, the Turkey was number one. Turkey became a member of NATO together with Greece, which is not unimportant. The same year as Greece, it became a NATO member. And it stayed a NATO member until now, even after the Cold War, as Greece has done. And the relationship with the EU specifically is also one which goes back a long way, well before the Maastricht Treaty of the 1990s, well before even the fact that we created a single market, and well before the fact that the EU became an major economic actor in the world. I mean, today the EU is a single market. It has a single currency. It trades with China and the US around the world and is of utmost importance. But before the 1980s, we didn't have a single market. We didn't have a real single market. We didn't have a currency. This simply didn't exist. Yet, Turkey and the EU, or the predecessor to the EU, already had a relationship, even back to the Ankara agreements of the 1960s. And so one has to ask oneself, oh, hang on, we're always thinking, and I will get to this later, the EU and Turkey are so important from an economic point of view. So why was it already so important even before that the economy was so established? And the reason is geography. We're so close, whether we look at a trade corridor, whether we look at a supply chain, whether we look at simple trade figures, or whether we look at security, or whether we look at our history, or whether we look at the population exchanges, or whether we look at legal agreements and treaties. The EU and Turkey, or the European countries and Turkey, have always had this very, very deep, sometimes complicated, but always relevant relationship. So I think it's important to start with this, because sometimes we forget about it within all the practical policy makings of today. Now, if we fast forward into history and we look at the last 20, 25 years, we will remember that the historical context of EU-Turkey relations is very much based on the history of the accession. And the history of accession is also controversial, because what we see with the history of accession in the 1990s is that Turkey is the only country in the world. This is also very important. The only country in the world that enters the EU's customs union. Customs union, sometimes we talk about it, customs union, okay, it's just another one of those economic treaties, another one of those relationships, but it's not. There's no other country in the world that's part of the EU's single economic area, which is not an EU member. This is very unusual, very unusual. When you ask most people, if you survey most people, they don't know this. The Turkey was given such a privileged position in 1995, 1996, which is to become part of the EU market. It means that you can trade goods back and forwards between borders, and it essentially allowed Turkey to become an economic powerhouse. I mean, for a lot of people, they might not remember, but Turkey back in the 1990s was struggling with an economic situation which was not very good. Before AKP and Tayyip Erdogan were elected, there was an economic crisis, and Turkey was not doing very well. Turkey did not have a defense industry which was booming. Turkey did not have extremely important export-oriented markets as it is today. And in many ways, the accession process, even though it has had a lot of difficulties, and I personally have a lot of skepticism about where it will go in the future, despite that, the accession process, the 35 chapters, the acquis, the harmonization of laws, and most importantly, the customs union that laid the foundation of all of this, allowed for a trading of goods and allowed for a boom in economic growth for Turkey. And it in many ways has shaped the Turkey that we see today. So that's a little bit about the historical context. Now, there are a lot of grievances. There are a lot of concerns about the accession process, and they come very much because of mistakes which were made on both sides, both by Turkey and also by the EU. First of all, Turkey became a candidate member or a candidate country, and it started the process of candidacy already back in the 2000s. And what happened is that immediately there were some stumbling blocks. There were some problems. One of the big problems which happened was that the government in place did not fulfill a lot of the Copenhagen criteria, the judicial independence. So what happened is that we saw, unfortunately, that the process of democratization, judicial independence, and media freedom did not reform in the way in which was expected from the accession process. This was, I think, arguably very much a mistake on the Turkish government side. But at the same time, we also saw mistakes on the EU side. Like, for example, in 2004, there was the accession of Cyprus as an EU country, which also had an impact on the Turkish accession, in the sense that Cyprus wanted to solve some of its problems with Turkey, and of course put in a veto with regards to the accession process. And we saw this on numerous occasions. Now the question is, could Turkey and the EU maybe have made a better effort in solving the Cyprus question, maybe before, or maybe even during? Yes, I think that's definitely something which should have taken place. It should have been an incentive to solve it. But unfortunately, it didn't become that, and it became a lingering problem which remained unsolved. The third problem, which also occurred, is that for anyone who knows the recent history, the EU enlarged 10 countries in 2004. And this had impacts on how EU countries and their own populations inside the EU viewed accession. Accession is an interesting thing. It allows for an increase in market share, and it allows for a lot of growth and influence. But of course, it also creates concerns within EU member countries. And there are certain political parties which became increasingly skeptic of enlargement. And over the last 20 years, we essentially saw a growth in what we call enlargement fatigue, which has since then turned into a type of both, let's say, a hard left and hard right apprehension vis-a-vis enlargement. And this also affected Turkey's chances of accession. And so all of these things combined, these three things that I mentioned combined, they then led to a divergence, to a separation in many ways on foreign and security policy between EU member countries and Turkey, which gradually led to further deterioration of the situation inside of Turkey. I mean, for example, in the years afterwards, we saw a breakdown of the peace process with the PKK. What many regard inside the EU as a huge missed opportunity. A lot of effort was made in order to enhance the chances of that peace process. Unfortunately, that was not taken. And there are many reasons for that. Some electoral, some genuine security threats coming from Syria. Depending on who you ask, they will give you one answer or the other. The truth is that it's a combination. And of course, we had the failed coup in 2016, which on one side drew some criticism from the EU in terms of the aftermath of that failed coup, and at the same time also drew a lot of animosity between actors. And of course, the ongoing civil war in Syria, and also to some extent in Iraq, which also deteriorated relations between the EU and Turkey as well. And so since then, what we can say is that we've been in a deadlock. Both sides have increasingly become suspicious and had problems with one another on all of these topics, and also many more, unfortunately. And that has led to a bit of a deadlock in the relationship. However, the reality is that even though all of these things have created animosity and problems, as I started the conversation with, the relationship is extremely relevant. So even though all of these problems have occurred and these divergences have happened, the reality is that Germany has 7,500 or 8,000 companies in Turkey. France has more than 1,500. The Netherlands has more than 2,000. Just to give you a comparative measure, how many Chinese companies are there in Turkey? Less than 1,500. So, I mean, you quickly understand that even though all of this media attention is paid to the problems in Syria, Cyprus, democratic backsliding, accession reports on an annual basis that get sent back to the EU with disgruntled bureaucrats, sometimes for good reason. Despite of all these issues, which are very mediatized, the relationship with nearly any other part of the world is insignificant compared to the relationship between the EU and Turkey. So it is in many ways a paradox. Very mediatized and sometimes problematic relations, but arguably the deepest supply chains, the deepest trade relations, the deepest company and foreign direct investment relation, the only country in the world that has a customs union relationship, and so forth. So I think this very much explains the paradox of EU-Turkey relations. I'm happy to talk more about it, but maybe I can ask you a question, Zuhal. Do you have any specific area that you would like me to talk about more than another?
Yes, actually, because we are from International Relations Department, we always discuss in our classes these impediments in front of the Turkish membership deriving from these bilateral problems. Maybe with Greece, it is a little bit overcome, but still there are several problems like the Aegean problems and the considered threat coming from the east from the perspective of Greece. But also the Cyprus. I had some notes about this, let's say, the seminar before the meeting. Especially, I noted how to overcome the Cypriot problem in front of Turkish membership. It's a real problem to overcome. And we always refer in different seminars, maybe there is one way for overcoming that. It is related with how to decide inside European Union, maybe from unanimity to the majority decision-making mechanism. So is it possible to overcome the problem like that? Or is it a total kidnapping process of this, let's say, the membership or the candidacy process of Turkey? I don't know. This is existing in my mind, first of all, to ask. Do you think that is it possible to overcome the problem somehow deriving from the Cyprus?
Yeah, I mean, I think on Cyprus, thinking that the problem will be overcome simply by qualified majority voting, QMV,
yeah,
is too easy. And unfortunately, I think the way to overcome the Cyprus problem is to actually tackle the Cyprus problem.
Yeah.
Going around the issue with QMV would force the hand of a member state, which is Cyprus, and it would create a lot of problems. To think that the EU Foreign Affairs Committee or any of the EU Council functions in vacuums is a mistake. If something like this were to happen, then Cyprus would immediately block other things. And it would be able to have an impact on a whole range of other bilateral relations inside the EU, which would create a problem for Germany, France, and other countries and so forth. So I'm personally not convinced by the idea of finding the easy way, which is simply to say, okay, implement QMV, and then there will be no longer any problem. No, I think the problem at stake has to be solved properly, and there are two layers of solving that. One layer is the very local layer on the island. There are some issues which historically have to be solved, and which are local issues, which concerns some of the countries that have a protectorate status, and which concerns the main two actors on the island. And then but in order to get to this kind of solution, as we have seen historically, it's been very difficult. And so there needs to be something additional on the table. And so we have to look, and this is where international relations become interesting, because you cannot solve a a very local conflict or a very local problem like the Cyprus problem without offering something to Turkey that it really wants, particularly with regard to the EU, and also that Turkey would need to offer the EU that the EU really wants. And so here we can start looking at, mapping out what are the divergences and differences and what are the potentials. So on the divergences and differences side, Turkey is very involved in Libya, which is creating a huge problem for France. And so there is negotiation capacity there. Turkey has, of course, involvement in Iraq and in Syria, which to some degree creates divergences for some member states as well. Turkey has been very influential in Azerbaijan and with regards to the Caucasus. Also there, we can see divergences again with France vis-a-vis Armenia. So those are some of the geographical areas. There are quite a few more because Turkey is a country that has been extremely active in diplomacy over the last years. And as a result, there are some pieces of the puzzles which can be added up, which could have an impact even in a negotiation on Cyprus. Then there are also other areas, like, for example, there are trade divergences between the EU and Turkey. So, for example, within the customs union, Turkey is not always abiding by the rules of the customs union. Also, the EU sometimes has not abided perfectly to them either. But there's been a lot of protectionist measures by the Turkish government on the customs union. This is something which has created a lot of concern for EU members as well. So there's also negotiation to be found here. And to be honest, the list goes on. There are quite a few. But what I'm trying to say here is that when solving an issue that is so grounded and of such national importance for one of the EU member states, and so territorially important as well, and so key to the EU and to Turkey, it's important also to look outwards and to look at all the other areas as well, which can help solve that problem too.
Yes, it's obvious that there are many divergences, as you mentioned, but this story starts to be a kind of discussion, which is the first, which is the following. So this is a real discussion topic in the EU-Turkish relations. But how to overcome these impediments, these divergences are very important question. That's why I refer Cyprus automatically, because as you mentioned, if you are a full member, you can find a way to put a barrier if there are some reservations. And it's understandable from the perspective of EU's decision-making mechanism. That's why actually from Turkish side, there is a kind of it's not disappointment, it's something more, maybe a kind of losing hope to have a kind of progress. And also in Turkish public, we have also some ideas like Turkey had a similar perspective in the 1990s, and especially during the bilateral rapprochement with Greece, there was a nice progress, but at that stage, during the Annan plan, and everything is somehow exhausted for not for peace, actually, for having a kind of progress, utilization of the process for the Cypriot membership. So, even today we see the similar things in other cases like Bulgarian, Macedonian name dispute issue and others. So if you are a member inside the EU, it creates a kind of leverage in the hand of the member country. So at that stage, the question, would you like to be ready to pay for what? This is the kind of the deal, actually. This is the main problem, maybe. I would like to ask our attendees would you like to have any question? We have dear professors from our European Studies Institute and also from other institutions in our country. Would you like to have any question, to ask any question?
Could I ask a question?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. First, thank you for the lecture. I wanted to ask, because when we talk about EU-Turkey relations, there's a lot of, power and identity dynamics involved, and a lot of cultural issues as well. So when we talk about the Cyprus issue, for instance, or the Kurdish question, or other human rights related issues that the EU so often holds against Turkey's membership, right? To what extent this aspects could be considered just, a kind of masquerade for deeper cultural and identitarian claims of the EU? Because when we speak about the 2004 enlargement, for instance, there was not any of those issues, these big issues of, Copenhagen criteria and so on and so forth. And when we speak about EU-Turkey relations, there's often this exclusionary perception of Turkey that, I mean, it's damaging to the relation, and it's reflected in the relationship as well. And it kind of generates this dynamic of competition in a way that it's so reflective of the relationship in itself. So what is your vision on it, if these practical questions as the Cyprus issue and the Kurdish question are just mere concealers for deeper identity questions?
That's a great question. Thank you so much, Kayo. I come from a specific school of thought, so I will share the way in which I see this. Now, there are many, many people who will disagree with me on this, but this is exactly how I see it. Democracy and human rights and rule of law is a realistic structural tool. I personally think it's a good thing, but I'm not reticent or in denial of why it exists. It exists historically because in any place where the private sector expands, the private sector that makes a lot of money, and we've seen this in the Enlightenment period and with the birth of capitalism, immediately the private sector and whoever accumulates money will look towards one person as the threat, a sovereign ruler. Because in a society, you have to think about, don't think about the 21st century. Think about when this first started over the last 300 years. All of a sudden, for most of history, all money was just accumulated in the hand of the state. That means in the hand usually of one male ruler, historically speaking. Not a good thing, but that's just how it was. And all of a sudden, what happened, it happened essentially during certain moments of the 15th and 16th century, but it happened even more with industrialization later, is that enormous amounts of wealth accumulation occurred within private hands. It just didn't exist before. A little bit with the guilds in the medieval era, but very limited amount. Now, what happens when this amount of accumulation or this amount of money is accumulated in a new set of hands? It means that there's no longer one power holder. It's not traditional autocracy. It's a plutocracy or oligarchy or whatever you want to call it. It's the birth of a type of real democracy. I mean, I'm not talking about Athenian democracy, like it's beautiful, but very brief, about 50 years. But in the true sense of the word, I mean, in our history, that's actually the birth of democracy because, and of course, it's not even close to the democracy we have today and so forth, but it's the first time in which there's a division between power. It means that the state is no longer the absolute power holder. There's also the private sector. And what does the private sector immediately do? They fund media. And they do it for a very simple reason, because they fear the sovereign actor, the prince, the fiefdom, the lord, because what do you do as a sovereign any autocrat, it doesn't matter anywhere around the world. If you're an autocrat and there's a huge wealth accumulation somewhere in your society, that means that there's a second power holder that competes for your power, and also there's a lot of money to be taken. And they didn't like that. So what did they do? They funded media, and in many ways, it's the source of arbitration. It's where historical judicial independence comes from, which is very interesting because I'm a big fan of judicial independence. It's great. Today it benefits a lot. It's not perfect, but it benefits a lot of society. But its origins don't come purely from values. I'm not saying that if you look at Enlightenment period and you look at like Montesquieu, French philosophers, or philosophers all around the world for that sake, they're writing about all of these beautiful things, but they're happening in tandem with this power division. And so that's very important. So how do I relate that to today? It's a very simple way. It's that when there's discussion about democratization and rule of law in Turkey, it is, of course, based on values. It's based on the institutional framework that we have in the European Union and the West and so forth. And I would also argue very much in Turkey to some degree as well. Turkey is not some kind of alien island to this. It has a long history also of independence and judiciaries. Even in the Ottoman Empire, these things are not, these are not like, they don't happen in vacuum. But a large part of it is the fact that private sector money entering Turkey, which has a lot of benefits, don't dare to do so if there is no judicial independence. Because would you invest your money in a country where you're not sure that arbitration would take place? No. You would fear that. You wouldn't know. Imagine you're Siemens and you have an arbitration with Bosch, or you're Total and you have an arbitration with Eni or something like that. These big companies, they have arbitration all the time. And if they don't feel like there is a court or that there is a judicial framework that is going to, at least to some degree, create impartiality in their judgment, then the risk for them is too high. So I think that's a very kind of like, it's a little bit historically cynical, but also very realistic interpretation of why we have courts and media and so forth today. And I'm not saying this in any kind of way to denigrate them. Some people will say this and say, oh, I wish it was all value-based. I'm not saying that. It's a combination of it. Like our societies evolve with universities and values and NGOs and activism and political parties and people who, cross hands and make protests. And that's why we have labor laws. But in many ways, you have to understand that part in order to also understand that the EU is serious about judicial independence and rule of law, because there's a huge private sector behind it. And I think that's undeniable. That's about the democracy, human rights, with a little bit of historical context. Then about culture and identity. Culture and identity matter, absolutely. I think in the European Union today, we see this resurgence of culture and identity, of the Western identity, of the, in many ways also this kind of like nationalistic, somewhat xenophobic as well. And you see that in correlation with the far right. I think, unfortunately, it's also happening in Turkey. I've seen this swing towards a hard right, towards an anti-migration mindset. I always joke, I say this with a lot of sadness, but I joke about it still, which is, how do you know that Turkey is really a European country? Well, they're following the exact same schematic modeling of party politics in terms of anti-migration and far-right politics as the EU. And so I think this is a tendency that's occurring everywhere. I mean, we can go into that discussion. It doesn't have much to do with international relations, but there are certain dynamics that are happening, which I think partly are inevitable, and some of them are absolutely social media induced, and they're very problematic. And with regards to EU-Turkey relations, it of course creates friction because these identitarian and more far-right leaning policies, parties, and views are also the ones that are less inclined to say yes to accession. They're the ones that are less inclined to say, I want to have trade with countries around the world. They're the ones who want to reshore a lot of their economic base. And they're also the ones that, of course, have these kind of identitarian cultural issues with Islam and so forth. Now, in the greater scheme of things, I think, and I don't want to really make an argument for this because I'm not a particularly big fan of the far right in any kind of way, but I think in the greater scheme of things, Turkey is probably much better positioned to be relating with the increasing far right in the EU, simply because you look around Muslim countries in the world, and there are just not that many that are as secular, even with all its problems, as Turkey today. So I'm not too fatalistic about this, but yeah, that's about culture and identity. And then one thing you might want to take into consideration as well is that culture and identity shapes the party politics. And it changes the culture in the European Union. That's true. And party politics deeply matters also in the relationship with Turkey. However, there's also another relation, which is very important, which is countries like France, especially France, have often said, oh, it has to, have often at least portrayed an image that it has to do with identity and Islam. Whereas often when you scrape the surface, you realize that it also has a lot to do with power sharing. France is often not so interested in having a lot of, an expanded European Parliament where Turkey would get a lot of seats. It might not be so interested in having Turkey at the table as a veto power at a time in which it has so many differences in many other theaters around the world. So France has also historically, and this is somewhere between identity and power, France has historically been very, very nervous about the trajectory of Turkey in the last 20 years away from traditional secularism. So they're not individual entities; they're combined, I think, to many degrees. But it's a great question, and something we can talk about a lot.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Who else wants to ask a question? Do you have any question?
Hello.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the event, Zuhal Hocam, and also thank you for the participation. Actually, I have a question because there's now a great proceeding. Turkey is directly engaging with BRICS, and we know that EU and the US are totally reactive. They are asking a lot of questions, especially about the scope of this relationship. On the other hand, what I believe is that such an undertaking, I don't know, maybe per the statement of the president as of today, because there is a statement in the newspapers. I just wonder one thing, and I want to affiliate it with the European stance. First of all, if you go through the end of the Ottoman Empire, there was a saying in European halls, Ottomans or Turkey is in Europe, but not of Europe. We remember that. And today, maybe Turkish attempt to be a nominated country to EU candidacy along with BRICS, well, it directly depicts something for me. It does have a meaning. If I'm not in Europe and not of Europe, maybe in Europe, but not of Europe, then there must be alternatives in terms of aligning the policies, aligning the future with the other actors. So what is the perception of Europe? I mean, first, if Europe see Turkey as if, a country not of Europe, first question, I know that you will touch values, democracy, human rights, etc., are respected. And the second question, if not, do you expect a probable rapprochement of Turkey and BRICS countries? Is it an opportunity or risk for Europe? Thank you.
Yeah. So, I mean, actually, on Turkey, not this idea of Turkey not being part of Europe, I have if we have to measure it based on democracy and human rights, then I think there's a lot of places that are not part of Europe. I think like Spain and Portugal for most of the 20th century could not be regarded as Europe. All of Eastern Europe would be considered non-Europe. Today, Hungary would not be considered Europe. A lot of countries in Southeast Europe and the Balkans, which in cultural terms have always been regarded as European, which is also an irony because they're part of the Ottoman Empire, right? So where does the line go? Where does this division, imaginary division that everyone talks about, lay? I have no idea because it doesn't exist. And so I think in that sense, I think we have to remember who wrote history, and there is no doubt that a lot of Western books have been very affluent in writing history on these topics. And at times it has been very convenient to say, okay, this was Ottoman, this was retrograde, this was different, it didn't function, they're not European, et cetera, when in fact, when you look at the treaties, when you look at the banking loans, when you look at some of the cultural exchanges, especially in 19th century Ottoman Empire into 20th century, it was treated identically as any other empire in the European context. So I have a lot of difficulties. I have a lot of difficulties believing that this is a reality more than a narrative that is being brought up for often the wrong purposes. So I think it's very important to differentiate. And I think in the same way that you find these narratives not only on the international European stage, but you also find them inside countries as well. I mean, inside Turkey, there have been narratives of, oh, are you from Ege? Are you from, Karadeniz? Are you from Anatolia? Oh, it's so different. Of course, there are differences. And you go to Manchester and you go to London, there's enormous differences economically, even in dialects and how people talk. This is a reality. The question is, how do you use those differences in narratives to then shape where you want to build your alliances and what the union should look like? And I think you're right in the sense that for a given period of time, there has been misuse of some of those narratives in order to create exclusion. I don't think that's a particularly good idea. And the reason why I don't think it's a particularly good idea is because, well, first of all, I think it has created a lot of friction and a lot of barriers, but also I don't think it matches reality in the sense that when we look at the economic trade volume, when we look at the foreign direct investment, when we look at the Ankara Agreement, the protocol of the 1970s customs union, when we look at even look at how people live in Istanbul and in many parts around Turkey, I don't think that it's in any remotely way that different from many parts of the European Union. And so I think that's an important component to bear in mind. With regards to the BRICS, I mean, if I put myself in the position of India, Brazil, it makes absolute sense to establish the BRICS. The BRICS have the purpose of trying to renegotiate what some countries consider unfair or non-interest-based for them economic relations. I mean, if you're India or if you're Brazil, of course you're going to do this. You're going to create a group. You're going to say, listen, we're in the either low to middle income, high population, growing sectors with limited technology. And we are in need of this and this and that. And by coming together and creating an association or a grouping, we can better serve those interests. I think it makes perfect sense. Now, how viable are those interests of Brazil and India with the interest of China and Russia? I'm not so sure. I think, first of all, they have really different interests. I think Brazil and India, and I think Turkey falls into that category too, even though they're not a member, they want to renegotiate some of the relations, especially economic relations, to their benefit. Whereas Russia, I think, has a more disruptive role, kind of a deeply revisionist view. We would like to see, to some degree, a collapse of so-called, financial international regulatory frameworks of the 20th century. And I think China played the game for a long time since it entered WTO in the early 2000s. And now it realized that it's no longer welcome by the United States. And also, I mean, China has not been acting like a saint either. I mean, when you look at copyright infringement and all these kind of things, and anti-dumping measures have been very problematic. But realistically, I think that the United States is simply not interested in a relationship with China anymore. It regards it with a high level of animosity. And as a result, China also knows that it is inside the BRICS for a disruptive reason, not for a negotiation reason. This is my personal interpretation. I could be wrong, but this is how I view it. So I think that there are really two camps inside BRICS that fundamentally don't align. And that's just on the view of how to do economic policy in the world. Then when you look at the actual differences, for example, between China and India inside of BRICS, beyond how they want to trade with the economic relationship with the West, they have some very, very significant differences, which I cannot even imagine how they wish to overcome. I mean, they have enormously high levels of territorial disputes. They have disputes over the biggest water source of the world, the Himalayas, which every single year becomes more and more and more serious for obvious reasons. We lack water, and they're essentially competing, increasingly China less, but India more. And at least for the last 10 years, they've been competing for supply chains, technology, and a relationship with Western foreign investors. So I have difficulty seeing how China and India can shape a coherent front within BRICS. I think it's a very superficial relationship.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other question? Do you have any other question? Mesut Hocam siz mi? Yok, yanlış gördüm. Okay. Okay, then I was planning to ask BRICS question, but it is already asked. So if there is no another question, we came to the end of our session. Actually, we have so many things to discuss, maybe, but this online seminars shall be limited for a short period of time in order to upload it into the let's say the online platforms. Thank you for your acceptance our invitation, and it was a pleasure to host you here and listen to your thoughts. And also for our attendees, we hope to meet in another program. Thanks. Thank you. Have a nice day. Bye bye.
Thank you very much. Çok teşekkürler. Have a great day to all of you and a good weekend.
It was nice to have you. Bye bye.